Hey, uncomfortable listeners, this is Eric. I just wanted to pop in here with a quick trigger warning about this episode. We are going to be talking with our guest about abortion procedures and what happens in the procedure room. So this is definitely not suitable for younger audiences. I just wanted you to be aware of that before diving into this episode. Welcome to Uncomfortable, conversations about culture and Christianity. My name is Eric, and today I'm joined by Jess.
Hello, world.
And Alex.
Good day, everyone.
Hello. And we have a very special guest with us today, Kristen New. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Yeah. Well, why don't we start off today because we're going to be hearing some stories from you from a past career where you were an abortion counselor, if that's correct. Yes. And you're going to be sharing some of your stories with that, your insight to that, and kind of how it's transformed you into the person you are today. So if you wouldn't mind, introduce yourself a little bit to our listeners.
Yeah. My name is Kristen. I'm a counselor over at City Care, and I don't know, there's no special population in particular that I deal with, but a long time ago, I was an abortion counselor. I worked in 2 different abortion clinics, and I think it's an important story to tell because that is literally where God met me. And so, yeah.
Great.
And Kristen said that you work over at City Care, and we work over at City Care together and are good friends. And so we've had great conversations like leading up to this, and just has been really insightful. And so I'm glad that we're having this conversation today. And Kristen, you've shared with me that there's a verse in Titus that's been really helpful for you as we have this discussion. So I'm going to read it, and I would just love for you to just to share how that's impactful to you. So Titus 3:3-7 says, "At one time we were too foolish, disobedient, deceived, and enslaved by all kinds of passions and pleasures. But when the kindness and love of God our Savior appeared, he saved us, not because of righteous things we had done, but because of his mercy."
Yeah, that was a very, I remember I was a new Christian when I read that. And what came into my mind was, oh my goodness, that was me. And I rewrote that in the first person in my Bible because to me it described how I was feeling internally and even how that was externalized in my world. I was really angry just about what life had been. Felt like I was dealt a really rotten deck of cards and wasn't fair. And as a result, I really took up what I know now as a sin pattern of self-idolatry, where I really felt like I knew what was right or wrong and that I could make those judgments, and they were based upon feeling. I did grow up in an alcoholic home, and I had a congenital heart defect that did require major surgery when I was 5. So there was always this sense of, gosh, I'm different, or I don't exactly belong, or I don't. A big thing was I felt like I didn't have a voice. So to me, that verse was just all the horrible things about how that played out in my life.
Well, thank you. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. And I think, especially heading into the conversation we're having today and some of the stories that you're going to share, that's such a good reminder for all of us, because I think this conversation, around abortion, I mean, even putting a title out there and putting it on the internet, there's going to be all sorts of flags that'll end up on their fact checking and things like that. But this is just one of those things, especially in our world, in our politics and morality, is just a conversation that can lead people down a lot of paths of shame, paths of anger, just a lot of mess. And so I think we really want to remember in this conversation to approach it with grace, that this isn't like about telling you who to vote for or how to vote in this. This is sharing Kristen's real stories and a story that she walked through. And so we just invite people as they listen to listen with grace and remember that every single one of us here behind a microphone has encountered Jesus and realize that there's things in our lives that we've messed up, and he's still saving us from a lot of those things. We're still a work in progress. So I just want to throw that out there for the listener as we're having that conversation. And just thrilled to have you here, Kristen.
Good.
Thanks.
So you mentioned you had a heart defect as a child and that you grew up in an alcoholic home. How would you say those experiences shaped your worldview and kind of the person you started to become or became?
That's a whole topic in and of itself. I'll try to be short. So whenever you are a child and you have major medical trauma like that, it's called developmental trauma. And there's a lot of times there are not words for it. So it can become, because there's a feeling of unsafety, you can become really controlling of your environment, just trying to manage things. And when you grow up in an alcoholic home, kind of the typical rules are don't talk, don't trust, and don't feel. So combine that with all this medical trauma, and you kind of have a recipe for not great things.
And then you also shared a little bit earlier from an early age that you felt like, and I think also because of what you just shared, like you could only rely on yourself.
Yes.
And so then as you got older, how did that belief evolve? Like how did it lead you to that place of self-reliance and eventually to be atheism?
So growing up in that kind of environment, the conclusion that I came to was that I could only count on or trust myself. And so what that led to then was just like also not being willing to let other people care for me. I didn't really believe that anybody was trustworthy or capable either. And, that really leads you on a path of kind of what I said earlier of developing a sin pattern of self-idolatry. Even though I didn't know that's what it was at the time, once I became a believer, I could really see that pattern in my life.
Would idolatry look like just self-reliance or like
self-reliance, severe hyper-independence? I truly believed that I could decide what was right or wrong. Like there was no moral compass other than my mind or what I thought or felt. And it was just a very, very, it was not able to be penetrated by anything other than the Holy Spirit much later on in my life.
Yeah.
And so that all led to
atheism.
I don't need God.
Yeah.
Like,
oh no, I did not.
I'm independent.
God?
I have these.
Yeah, no way. I couldn't see him. I had no religious training. I didn't grow up in a Christian home. My mother was a believer, but my father did not believe in organized religion. So in order to sort of keep the peace, I was never exposed to really anything remotely Christian at all.
Yeah, I'm guessing during your adolescence and that, especially that time in our history, as a country, feminism was on the rise, and a lot of these conversations began, really around abortion and women's rights, and there was a lot of people fighting for a lot of different rights, especially a couple decades ago. So how did just that time in history and the feminist movement and all of that kind of shape you walking into this career as an abortion counselor and all that kind of stuff?
It very much did, because when I was in high school, I sort of got wind of this movement. And so I started writing papers and doing speeches. And I got a lot of accolades for that, which felt really good, right? Because I wasn't necessarily getting that at home. And so I began to believe, truly, I really believed that abortion helped women. That was what I believed. I believed that a baby developing in the womb was nothing other than a blob of tissue. It was not a human being. And so me kind of developing that mindset as an adolescent, then led into wanting to be more and more involved in that movement.
So you worked as a counselor in 2 abortion clinics. I guess my first part of the question would be, can you help people understand what that role was? Like, what does that look like on maybe a daily basis, or what you were involved in?
I was a patient counselor, so I provided counseling before somebody has an abortion, during an abortion, and after an abortion.
Okay, and so then I'm assuming your history with the feminist movement and things like that led to that role. Was there anything else that you feel contributed to getting involved in that?
I wanted to be an advocate for women because I really felt like it was helping them.
And so that was kind of your motivator. That's what you felt like you were making a difference. And I guess even in today's context, when you hear people talk about reproductive rights, I mean, would it have been a similar context that you were talking about it? Like this, you were defending reproductive rights.
Totally. I was a member of NOW. The personal is political, all the things.
Yeah, that's good.
So you mentioned, and you talked to me about just different events that have happened in your life. And there was kind of like 3 pivotal events that began to soften your heart during this time that you were working in an abortion clinics. Can you start to talk through those events? What started to change your perspective?
Well, there were 3 pivotal events, and I would say the first one didn't soften. I would say it solidified my view. So my very first day ever of working in an abortion clinic, I arrive early on a Saturday morning, and there are, I don't even know how many hundreds of people that were protesting. And this was back in the late 80s, so they were still allowed on the premises. So they were like in the parking lot. They were physically restraining women from entering the clinic.
Oh, wow.
And I may be little in stature, but when I think I'm right, I can feel like I'm 20 feet tall. So I hop out of my car. I go grab this woman that they're trying to hold her back. I'm like, come on, you're going with me. And we just made our way through this sea of people. And right when I got up to the clinic stairs, one of the protesters looked at me and said, I hope you die a slow, painful death with cancer. And I remember thinking, that's probably one of the meanest things anybody's ever said to me. I think I'm right. You're being really mean, and I'm being nice. And that just like confirmed what I was doing. Then the second thing was an interaction that I had several years later at the second abortion clinic. It was Saturday morning again. And I was waiting for the elevator, and I hear this voice from the corner say, please don't hurt your baby. And I turn around and I look, and I said, I don't have a baby. She said, well, then why are you going up there? I said, I'm a counselor. That's why I'm going up there. And she said, oh, well, can I pray for you? Okay, remember, I am not a Christian. I have no idea about the power of prayer. I said, sure. You can pray for me. She said, what's your name? I told her my name. And I went on about my merry way. And that was like in November. And I graduated then in December. And then in January was when the 3rd pivotal event happened. So all of this time I've been in graduate school. And so I didn't have a lot of free time to work. So it was really tight schedule. And I was only involved in the first trimester abortions. So once I graduated, they asked me, would you mind to start doing these second trimester abortions? I'm like, sure. Okay.
And second trimester, for those that don't know, is?
They're a 2-day procedure. Usually those 2-day procedures begin around 14 to 16 weeks.
Okay.
Yeah. I don't know that you really want me to go into all the details of an abortion
Well, I just
procedure.
was, just trying to think like, okay, second trimester is past 12 weeks. Like
Yes.
these little babies are
Yes.
older, bigger.
Oh, yes. Yeah. So I had done pre-counseling before, but I'd never been in an actual procedure. So this was my first time doing the pre-counseling and then going into the procedure with the young woman that I counseled. So I did the pre-counseling. She had the lemon area placed, came back the second day. I was there to go in the procedure with her. And I got her in there, got her settled. We got her asleep. I was just holding her hand, and the doctor began the abortion. And there was nobody for me to really talk to, so I just looked at the ultrasound machine because the second trimester abortions have to be done under ultrasound. Mm-hmm. And so I was watching as the doctor went in with these clamps and grabbed a leg, and the baby yanked its leg out of the clamps. The doctor went back in, and he grabbed an arm, and then the baby pulled its arm out of those clamps again. And I watched as that baby literally curled up into a fetal position at the top of the woman's uterus to protect itself. And I'm watching this, and I'm in utter shock, and I thought I was going to faint. And so the doctor told me I could just leave. So I left and sat out in the hallway on the floor, just sort of completely flabbergasted, going, oh my gosh, that was a human being that was fighting for its life. And when they finished and they came out with a tray, I went into the room where we processed all of the fetal tissue, and I said I wanted to see the tray. And the woman's name was Angie. She said, no, you don't want to see the tray. And I said, no, I need to see that tray. And so she opened it up for me, and I saw this perfectly formed, beautiful little baby boy that was missing 2 legs and an arm. And I just knew at that point that I couldn't do it anymore. And I met with the doctor afterwards and just said, I have no idea how you can do this. How can you do that? That baby fought you the whole time. He said, I know, sometimes they're fighters. And he has his own trauma story. And he said to me, Kristen, you know my story. You know why I do what I do. I said, I can't do it. He said, okay, don't worry. I'll take care of it. We'll just leave you in first trimester. And then I was out of there as soon as I got my first job.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. I think
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I'm curious. When he says I have my own trauma story, we don't have to get into it, but I am curious what how they justify it, and I think our listeners would be too. Can you give us a brief idea of what that meant to him?
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
His trauma story was that when he was a resident, there was a woman that came in with a botched abortion, and he tried to save her, and he couldn't save her, and she died. Mm-hmm. And so just like how we can all sometimes make vows, he made a vow that no woman would ever die under his care as a result of a botched abortion.
Okay. That's helpful.
That is. And yeah, I can't imagine being in that spot because I'm just thinking of, man, just watching my wife give birth, 4 times, and then also just picturing all that happening, and so you make this decision. How did it affect you? How did you go from that day? Hey, I've been in doing first trimesters. I've been fighting for this. I've been fighting for these women. I have made it possible in a lot of ways for this to happen. And then you have this traumatic experience. How did was it just the snap of a fingers? Things changed, or how did you reconcile and wrestle through all of that when most of your life was working up towards that's what I've worked toward. That's what I've tried to protect. Just how are you wrestling through this in your mind at this point?
I think at that moment, it became so real that was a human being that I couldn't ignore it anymore. And I think that was just sitting in that hallway. I just remember that softening in my heart of, this is wrong. this is just wrong. That was a human being. So I didn't really understand what was happening. I mean, to be clearly honest, I did not understand what was happening. I understand now, having walked 33 years with the Lord, but I had no clue back then. I was just going, all I know is that this is wrong. That was a human that was fighting, and I can't do it anymore.
So after this, it led you to work as a medical social worker. Is that correct?
Yeah, I worked as a medical social worker for 15 years.
Okay, so then your colleagues there were believers.
They were. A lot of them were.
And so, I mean, all of this, I mean, from the point when that woman prayed for you to this point, how do you see God using all of this to work to glorify Him? And like, were you still kind of resistant in some of those moments? Or okay.
So when I look back now, I believe that that woman's prayers in the clinic in November that is the reason that I saw that second trimester abortion. It's the first one and the only one I ever saw, and it drastically changed my life. So I think as I didn't understand it back then. I didn't even understand it until I told this story for the first time, that God has just sort of been walking with me that whole time. And then He puts me into a work setting where a lot of these women are Christians. And I'm like, you people are annoying. You're really annoying. Like, you tell me this stuff that, oh, God loves me. He has a plan for me. And I'm like, what are you people talking about? And I did. I resisted I was my own God. So I didn't want to give that up easily.
Yeah.
When you quit, that profession, so it wasn't because you had this righteous encounter with Jesus and all of a sudden He came down and some religious people convinced you you're doing evil. Like, you, even before you knew Jesus or had a relationship with Him, you still internally felt like there's something not right about this, right?
I feel like He met me there. I feel like He knew what I needed. And so He met me there in that hallway and convicted me and began the process of tearing down the walls that were keeping me from Him.
Did you have a significant moment in your journey where you cried out to God? And what was that like? What was that moment like in your journey?
So I was out on a blind date, and I all of a sudden couldn't read the menu. And I was super good at pretending back then. So I just sort of made it through the day, went home, called the doctor in the morning, and everybody panicked. I didn't really realize that losing your central vision is like a big deal. So I went, and I had to have so many different like CT scans, MRIs, all this other stuff. Finally ended up at an eye doctor where he just said, did you have an accident? Did you fall? Were you playing sports or hit your head? And I'm like, no, I was literally on a blind date and I couldn't read the menu. That is all that happened. And he's like, well, I don't really know what this is, but it looks like somebody took a razor blade to the back of your eye. I said, well, what does that mean? Yeah. He's like, I honestly don't know, because I don't know what caused this. I don't know if I said, is it going to get worse? And he said, I have no clue, but here's a little grid. Look at it every day, morning and night, and then come back and see me in 3 months. So at that moment, God had literally just messed with everything that I held dear. Because I was living in Philadelphia, far away from my family, very independent, taking care of myself. And the thought, I am never going to live in Omaha, Nebraska over my dead body. Well, here I am. And and I was so desperate that night and so scared that I cried out to God, this God that I had no clue. And I just said, okay, God, these people tell me you're real and that you love me, that you have a plan for me, but like, can you help me? Can you just help me? I'm so scared, and I just don't know what to do. And I'm scared that I'm going to have to be dependent upon people. And I literally just cried myself to sleep. And in the morning, I woke up and I grabbed my little grid, and the black spot was gone. And I grabbed a book, and I could read. I was like, oh my gosh, I better get to church. Mm-hmm. And mind you, I had no idea what that meant. I literally had no idea what that meant. And I traveled around a bunch of different churches. About 6 months later, I found my way to a Bible-believing church where I could be discipled. And I've been walking with the Lord for 33 years now.
Wow.
Yeah. So what's that process been like then, from, working in that clinic and kind of running away before you even decided to follow Jesus, and then fast forward to blind date and finding out the vision stuff, and then sounds like a miraculous healing. Like,
yeah.
From there, like what's God called you to? What's your journey as you've realized, oh, those people weren't lying. God does love me. He does have a purpose. How does realizing that purpose and walking into it, how did that begin to change as you were being discipled in this church and reading the Bible and figuring out that purpose?
I think in the beginning, I'm just going to be really honest here. In the beginning, I had so much shame because I heard what fellow Christians said about people like me. Mm. And so I couldn't tell my story for probably about 12 years because I was so afraid of just the shame and the what kind of questions are people going to ask me? What are they going to say? Are they not going to take the time to understand what's happened in my life? And so after about 12 years, I think I had enough faith built into me that I don't care. And I began, I homeschooled both of my girls, and it began when my oldest daughter was in 8th grade, and she had to write a paper about abortion. And we were sitting down at the table, and she started to spew so much judgment. And I was like, oh, we got to have a talk. Because my kids had no idea at all. And so I told her my story, and she was like, Mom, you have to tell your story to my class because I know all these kids think like I do. And so it began when my daughter was in 8th grade, where I told my story for the first time. And that's kind of, then from there, I began speaking in high schools. I've done legislative work, still continue to do some of that. And it's played out in a lot of different ways. I also help facilitate Rachel's Vineyard retreats that are healing retreats for post-abortive women and men. So it's still very much a part of my life and what I do, and just the work of redemption and sharing what God has done in and through me, and just the hope that there is.
A sentiment that you've shared with us is that abortion will touch mostly everyone in some way.
It will.
And what's your perspective on how we as Christians can be more like Jesus when we engage with this topic?
One of the things that I find is that it's very polarizing, and people tend to go to black and white thinking, which is just not healthy. If you want to be clinical about it, it's a cognitive distortion. So my hope would be that we would learn to approach people with grace, because the women that choose abortion are desperate. They're desperate, and they're almost always feeling alone. They don't feel like there's resources. They don't know about resources. Mm-hmm. And so my thing would be always to be curious first about what does she need? What is missing? Be curious about the story. Is she being coerced? That's very common. coerced even just by a boyfriend, by family. Coercion can come in many different forms.
Yeah, and I think it kind of like you highlighted, even from your daughter, and that realization that she's, writing this very judgmental story. I think one of the things sometimes as Christians we don't understand when we're with our words, or maybe not so many words, kind of condemning someone to hell. A lot of the people are like, I already feel like I'm living in the middle of hell right now. Like what I'm going through, the pain that I'm going through. So to condemn someone there, they're just like, are you kidding? Like I'm trying to escape that right now. And the decisions I'm making, so many different nuances that can go into that conversation. And so I think having those real honest conversations and walking into those spaces, as Christians, I think we really want to fight for truth. And that's something and defend life and defend all of those things. But sometimes that black and white thinking that oftentimes we can fall into just forgets to approach people the way that Christ approaches us. We're each individual. Every one of us has our own story. Every one of us has our own wounds. Every one of us has our own traumas that we're wrestling with. And Christ meets us in the middle of those. He just doesn't give us this blanketed answer for every single person, but he individually meets every single person, which is just crazy that he does that. And it was ultimately, his kindness, like that Titus verse, like all of us are in the middle of this mess, and yet he met us and renewed us and makes us new. And so, yeah, that's a beautiful thing to share. Grateful for that. And I think as Christians, it's just a good reminder for us of some of those principles that sometimes we cling on to really tightly.
Mm-hmm. Well, and one thing that you and I were talking in the hallway once, and we were talking about the topic of abortion, and you were like, oh no, this is it. There's more than just the mom and the baby involved. Like we were having a conversation. You were like, oh, there's 3 people. And I was like, oh, wait, okay, mom, baby. And you were like, the dad, like they're like the men that are involved. Can you talk a little bit about that? Cause I think it really is like a missed population, or just like a missed thing that we don't talk about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there is definitely, men struggle with post-abortive trauma as well. There's an element of a powerless feeling that is very real, right? Because the woman is the one who's pregnant. But they are part of that baby as well. And that's partly why when we do the Rachel's Vineyard retreats, we invite men to come, because the post-abortive trauma is very real for them as well, because it's a loss for them.
I think even you sharing that has helped to make me more sensitive, because I think a lot of times, and especially just because this is very polarizing and it's very charged politically, we tend to focus on just like what we know and what we've heard. And so just even being open to thinking, oh yeah, there is other people involved, and how and what that affects. Mm-hmm. But just even talking about just how politically charged the topic of abortion is. Can you speak a little bit to just like how can we have more healthy, compassionate conversations about this in such a polarizing environment? I know that's a lot to ask, but I'm like, how can you give some wisdom in this area?
I think what I try to do is to set aside my desire to be right. And I try to set aside my desire to be right so that I can first understand, because sometimes there's a whole story. And I'm not saying that the whole story makes a decision for abortion right or wrong. I'm just saying that people need to be heard and understood. And a lot of times being heard and understood allows for bridges to be built, of where then I've built trust to where I have the right to say things, or to offer resources, or to think about alternative views. But if I'm more concerned about being right, for me, I think the pro-life movement has done a disservice of only focusing on the baby. I think that we need to think in terms of all of the people who are affected. And because of my position, I don't just think about mom, dad, and baby. I think about all the workers, the doctors. I think about all of those people.
If you saw me about like 30 minutes before we started this, you're like, that'd be a guy who really fights to be right all the time, even in a conversation I was having. So I think that's a desire for all of us. Is like, we really have this innate desire to be right. And sometimes we're like, even in the silliest of arguments, like this desire just to be right, just the things that you're talking about are so inconsequential, but we have this desire that we need to be right and power up on people. That's a part of just who we are as humans. I think it's part of our broken, flawed human nature. So I think when we have this conversation, we often say there's two sides, especially because we have a political environment that just says there's two sides and all of this kind of stuff. So how do you talk to somebody that's just wrestling through this? You know, you've been somebody that's at least lived in, advocated for at this point, both sides of this debate from, a woman's rights and a baby's rights and all the other parts that are in this. So how do you counsel someone that's really wrestling through this, having seen both of those, and that are really wrestling through making this decision? They've got a lot of difficulty and heavy-heartedness and all that. How do you counsel someone that's really trying to honestly work through a decision of having an abortion or not, or a family member having an abortion or not? How do you counsel people through that?
Well, the first thing I realize is that it's not between me and that person. It's between that woman and God. So I kind of take myself out of that idea of I need to convince her of something. My main thing is I try to be curious. I try to understand. I try to know the full story. I try to understand what the needs are, and then how can I help to meet those needs. I'm not so concerned about being right or trying to convince her to do something or to not do something, because I really have to trust God in that from my view. I don't know if that answers your question or not, but...
Oh, that's helpful. That's helpful.
So earlier we were discussing how when you're more of an advocate for abortion as a young person, and the conversation around reproductive rights is, it's probably maybe at an all-time high right now. I don't know, but it is, with new laws being passed banning abortion in certain states. How do you see it now? How do you see abortion as a part of women's health rights, and how do you balance that with your own convictions?
I guess I don't really see it as women's health rights. I just see it as an issue.
Yeah.
I think you can couch it in that, but I don't think it's really a women's health issue.
Yeah.
I think it's a spiritual issue. I think it's an economic issue. Like, I just think there's so many different layers to why a woman chooses. So, yeah, I don't like couching it necessarily in politics, really, because I think really it's emotional, spiritual, physical. There's so many different components to it.
Because it's I think one of the things that comes up is it's rare, but when the mother's life is in danger, and in that situation, is there ever, I guess that's maybe more the question I'm asking, is there ever a justifiable reason for an abortion, or is it something where it should just be avoided at all costs?
Okay, well, I'm going to tell you my true answer to that, which is I can't answer that for that woman.
Yeah.
How I view it is that I don't think abortion is ever necessary. I think there's a lot of different options for women. There's a lot of resources out there. And the other part, the argument that we often hear is that the women's health is at danger, right? The reality is that we know that if a woman's health is in danger, we can actually induce labor and have that child born early. And so we know that that doesn't always have to be the answer. I think that is between that woman and God.
Yeah.
But my personal view is that abortion never has to be the answer.
Because I think one of the most recent political talking points that have been going around is on both sides of the argument is there was a woman who was told by her doctor, well, if you go through with this pregnancy, the chances of you ever having another child are pretty much not at all. And so she wanted to have the abortion to, in her eyes, because of what her doctor told her, to preserve the right to continue to make a family in the future. Mm-hmm. And so I think a story like that, and I think a lot of people just aren't informed and don't have all the facts, but then that one becomes so politicized, it makes it challenging, because I think you put yourself in that position as a father, and you're like, well, if we're choosing between my wife or the child I've never met, that makes a really difficult choice. Mm-hmm. And so I guess sometimes I think people are maybe curious, like, well, how real is that? Like, how real is that decision that when that rare occasion happens?
So, like, are you even talking about like incest or rape or something like that?
I mean, I think that could be in the conversation. Okay. Yeah.
Well, I mean, those sorts of extreme cases are less than 1%.
Yeah.
I think because of my experience, I don't ever hold judgment against somebody who chooses to have an abortion. Mm-hmm. I really feel like any sin can be forgiven.
Yeah.
And that's kind of where I stand. But
no, that's helpful. But yeah, it's a messy thing to navigate, and it's challenging because I think a lot, like you said earlier, people, whether it's a cognitive defect or just wanting to be right, they want things to be black and white and cut and dry and easy, because then they have a talking point.
Yeah, and it feels safer, right? Black and white feels safer.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the things that I always kind of guide my life, my own personal life by, is that I remember that Jesus only ever got mad at the Pharisees. So I try to remember that. Mm-hmm. Like, how can I step away from any thinking that is similar to that, so that I can be present in this moment and set aside that desire to be right.
Yeah.
I think something that you, through your testimony and sharing your story, I'm just really reminded that the places that we feel most desperate or that we question or whatever, it's a good reminder that God is already in those places and he's meeting people there. And it's just a good reminder of just his faithfulness and that he's there, and we kind of get in the way of that sometimes. I feel like even myself, of just like having an opinion or having a thought, and just like, what a good reminder and just a precious reminder that Jesus is there. And you just shared so powerfully how God has met you in those places. And so kind of as we wrap up, do you have any thoughts or encouragement that you would want to leave with our listeners today?
I guess I want to just remind people that it's abortion. It will touch you, like you said, Eric. Everybody's going to be touched by it at some point. And to ask yourself the question, how can I be like Jesus, and how can I set aside my desire to be right in this moment in order to be present to a need? I think one of the things, too, is that we have to remember that if we only have compassion for that preborn child, and we don't have compassion literally for everybody, and I'm saying mom, dad, the abortionists, the counselors, the nurses, if we don't have compassion for all of them, that we are like literally missing the boat. Like, we are not really upholding the full truth of the gospel. And I really want to try to spur people on to living that fullness of the gospel in this hard place, because it's super messy. But I really think that's what God calls us to. I don't know. And the other thing, I just want people to remember that he met me in the hallway of an abortion clinic. You know, we tend to think of these places as complete evil, and I agree, they are evil. There is evil going on there, and I still believe that God can intervene there.
And that's so good, because that's the reality of all of our lives. And I mean, I don't know anybody that just got saved by a well-equipped argument. You know, people are like, Billy Graham, he was such a great person. Billy Graham didn't save a soul. Only the Holy Spirit of God did. And so sometimes we forget that it's not like, and as a preacher, as somebody that gets to preach, I'm like, we need to talk about truth. We need to talk about what the Bible says. We need to help people understand that. And yet there's also this mysterious thing that keeps me humble, realizing there's not a sermon that I'll ever preach that is going to actually save somebody, unless the Holy Spirit of God is the one that comes in, rescues, redeems somebody, unless I'm fully convinced by the Holy Spirit that I'm wrong and that there is a better way of flourishing out there. Then that's the only way it happened for me. And I think that's the only way it happens for everybody. And so I think one of the things I always remember, a guy named Ian Bounds said, because I think we have to obviously pray about this. It's a spiritual battle, but don't talk to someone about God unless you're talking to God about that person. Mm-hmm. And so I think we have to remember, that these people aren't the enemy, that the other side of the aisle is not the enemy. There's a real enemy out there. And his name is Satan, and he wants to keep people deceived. And so people that are deceived are actually victims. Yeah. And so if we understand that, and our hearts are, like, man, this is a victim. This is somebody who has been deceived by an enemy. They need help. And then I think our heart posture towards people begins to change in that, and we don't all of a sudden see them as enemies, but we see them as victims, and we begin to pray for them that they would meet Jesus and they would find healing, that they would find hope, and that they would be rescued. At least for me, that's just a helpful thing to remember in my own posture when I have this rage or this anger or the self-righteousness like a Pharisee, to remember that I too was an enemy of God, lost in my own sin, but by his grace, he said, no, I love you and I want to redeem you, and I want to keep saving you from the idolatry that you have in your own heart and your own life. And so, yeah, that's such a good reminder. Thanks for reminding us of that.
Kristen, do you have any resources, or is there any way where to point people maybe if they want to?
I think Assure, EPS, those are all great resources.
Assure?
Assure Women's Clinic.
Yep, Assure Women's Clinic.
What is EPS for those like me that don't know?
Essential Pregnancy Services.
Okay.
There's a number of, there's several, I think Assure has a couple different clinics, and I think EPS does too. They can Google. There's Rachel's Vineyard retreats. There's also, I can't remember what they call the counseling. It's Rachel's something. I'll have to look that up and I'll get it to you. But there are lots of places to get help and to receive the healing, because it's a trauma. It really is a trauma. And how do we heal that?
Well, thank you so much for your time today. We really appreciate it. I mean, I think your story is just so powerful, and it's going to meet people in a way that is challenging, but in probably all good ways, to hear those things that, on either side, where people are struggling with this argument. So again, thanks for your time today.
Thanks for having me.
And thanks to everyone who's listening, wherever you are. We appreciate it. And if you have any questions or concerns and you want to reach out to us, you can do that by sending us an email to podcast@cccomaha.org, or you can reach out to us on social media on TikTok or Instagram at CCCOMA Podcast. Or if you want to leave us a voicemail, there's a chance that you'll get to hear your voice on the podcast by calling 402-885-9930. But until next time, we'll talk to you then.